I'm a filmmaker, and I'm a very lucky one in that I get to shoot a lot in big, impressive landscapes. I also shoot a lot at this 2x4 foot IKEA desk. I make videos about science and history, so I need to include like maps and studies and archival photos. About a year and a half ago, I gave myself a challenge to stop using motion graphics. If I wanted to include a headline or a piece of art or a map, I had to find a way to photograph it practically. And that creative constraint has led me to find so many new creative ways to demonstrate concepts and just create a wide variety of interesting footage from, this desk. Today, I want to share with you what I've learned, techniques for building a little miniature world and capturing an interesting variety of footage in a very small, very constrained environment. Of course, the first step in this process is just gathering a whole bunch of archival elements. A few go-to sources are the Library of Congress, the National Archives, the British Library, the Wellcome Collection, the David Rumsey Map Collection, newspapers.com for finding old newspaper articles, the JSTOR Image Search, and Wikimedia Commons for sourcing public domain images. I'll print all that out, then hit the antique store to look for some interesting elements to scatter around the edge of the frame and set the scene. For a very science-heavy video about deep geological time, I included a clock and an hourglass and used a baking sheet to turn my wooden desk into a metal lab table, all keeping with kind of a clinical sci-fi vibe. For a video about volcanoes in the Caribbean, I wanted to feel like we're below decks on an old ship, using a magnifying glass, old bottles and keys and coins. It's pretty on the nose, but I thought it was cool. And for the most recent video I made about rainforests, I just threw in a bunch of fake plants. To shoot this footage, I used two cameras, one on my Peak Design tripod and the other on this silly little desk-mounted top-down arm. I can very quickly switch between these for different shots or capture the same action with both just from different angles. I light these shots using only one light, my Aputure 120D, right out of frame at about a 90-degree angle. I've tried a few times to light these sequences with lamps or candles for a cozier, more rustic vibe, but wasn't super happy with the results. So I came up with an alternative that I'll share later on in this video. Working within such a tiny, constrained space, there are a few techniques I use to make these images feel more immersive. One of the biggest is just keeping the entire frame within the bounds of the desk, you could say. You rarely see beyond the edges of it, and even when you do, the rest of the scene just falls right off into shadow. For all of the top-down shots, I use the Sigma 16-28 f2.8. That lets me get a good variety of different framing options without having to move the arm up and down that frequently. For almost everything else, I use the Sigma 35mm f1.4. That way I can get close to the subject and throw the rest of the scene completely out of focus. Occasionally, I'll use the Lumix 100mm macro to get even tighter shots, like individual words on a page. A classic, tried and true hack for adding depth and three-dimensionality to a scene is to incorporate some foreground elements really close to the lens. So shooting at this desk, that can mean just sticking a little piece of one of these plants right in front of the lens, or getting the camera really close to the surface of the desk. Despite the limited space, I try and introduce motion into the scene whenever I can. That can mean zooming in and out on the overhead camera, swinging the overhead arm around, or taking the camera off the tripod and shooting handheld. Being this close to the subject, having some kind of stabilization, whether it's optical or in camera or both, helps out a ton for making those handheld shots, usable. I also try to add motion within the static shots. That can mean dropping pages into the frame, underlining sections, or a lot of the time you can just see my hands doing something around the edges of the frame or in the foreground. One of my absolute favorite tools is this slide projector that I swiped from my grandmother's attic. So to include archival images, I have them converted from digital files into mounted slides, which I can then project onto my wall here. It's a much more complicated, much more difficult, and more expensive process than just putting an image on screen in the edit, but I think it looks kind of cool. I said earlier that I don't use any motion graphics, and that's a bit of a white lie. I'll occasionally add a little bit of compositing in post over this footage, usually for things that need to be completely accurate, like shading in an area of a map. And I do a few things to make these graphics kind of feel like an actual part of the scene. A lot of that happens in After Effects. I use the roughen edges effect, a bit of blurring, and some different blend modes to make graphics look more like actual pen strokes. But I honestly think the most important part is what I might call motivating the graphics. So if I'm adding a red line over a map, I'll make sure that in the shot you can see me put this red Sharpie down in the frame, kind of implying that I actually just drew that line. While we're in the edit, there are a few different ways that I color grade this footage depending on what's in frame. Usually that includes pushing some warmth into the highlights to double down on that rustic atmosphere, or desaturating yellows and greens so that papers look completely white or gray. But for shots that only have black and white images in them, I'll actually remove the color entirely, then add it back in using the color wheels. Doing that lets me control how yellow the paper is. So for sequences about history or mythology, I typically want it to look old and yellowed. But for a scientific study, I want it to look more new, white, and clinical. The slide projector we talked about earlier actually has a very warm tungsten light, so I mask out the picture and completely desaturate that as well. But my favorite is this fake candlelight look. I just use a stock clip of some flames, blur it way out, and set the blend mode to multiply. Then I can use the curves to tweak the brightness and color of the flames. It definitely does feel a little silly to me that half of my footage comes from big, faraway landscapes, and the other half comes from a little table in the corner of my office. But this has also become a process that I really enjoy and look forward to, and one that teaches me a whole lot about creating interesting images within creative restraints. And that's a lesson that definitely transfers to those big landscapes. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. This video is a little different, but I hope you learned something new from it. And if you did, be sure to subscribe to Adorama TV for thousands of other videos just like this one, including plenty of other videos where I show you filmmaking techniques that go beyond what we can do at my desk. We actually go out to some pretty cool places and shoot some really pretty footage and show you how. So if you want to learn something, go give those a look. Thank you for watching this one, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.